Hello, and welcome to In Their Own League. This is Brian Skutle. I'm a contributing writer to the league as well as a podcaster. You've heard me a couple of times on the YouTube channel as well as the In Their Own League podcast. I'm also a film critic, composer, and podcaster at Sonic Cinema, www.sonic-cinema.com. But today we are here for In Their Own League, and I felt like this discussion would be really great for a website and a platform where we celebrate female voices, underrepresented voices in cinema and TV. And I'm so pleased to have the guest that we have today. She is a culture critic, she is an author. She actually joined me over at Sonic Cinema back in December. We talked about the Stepford Wives movies together. That was fantastic. Please welcome to the podcast, Ella Dawson. Ella, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be a return guest.
And I am excited to talk to you about your novel because it was a few months out before when we talked about Stepford Wives, and it came out in early June. I had a chance to listen to the audiobook. Really enjoyed it. It's such a wonderful listen. But I would like you to set up for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you listened to the audiobook because I feel like the narrator, Jamie, really knocked it out of the park. And I had the
Yes.
opportunity to meet her a few weeks ago. She wound up going to summer camp with one of my friends who had a book coming out. So at the book launch for my friend Shelley's book, I realized it was just really fun to be like, oh, it's you. Your voice brought my book to life. But yeah, no, my book is called But How Are You Really? And it's about a millennial who goes to her 5 year college reunion. And she kind of reluctantly goes because her boss happens to be giving the commencement address at graduation that same weekend on campus. So she's really there to work. But while she's there, she reconnects with her friends from college. She reconnects with a very sweet ex of hers who she maybe wasn't mature enough to appreciate during college. And she also comes face to face with a bunch of trauma and memories from college that were not as great. So it takes place over those 4 days. It's very action packed. And I'm just so excited people can finally read it and that it's out in the world.
Yes. And if you haven't read it or listened to it, by all means, take a chance to do so. It's really a wonderful story. What was the what was the I know you've talked about it in your writing on Patreon and on social media. Where what was the inspiration to tell this story?
Yeah, so I went to my 5 year college reunion, and it's been funny talking about the book with folks. A lot of folks don't know the college reunions are a thing or wouldn't ever consider going, but I was so excited for my college reunion because for a long time I felt like I kind of peaked in college and I always wanted to go back. I think for a lot of millennials and Gen X folks, like college is this magical time for some of us where you're living close to your friends, you're in this very tight knit community, it might be walkable. And then when you graduate and you go into the real world, you feel so disconnected from everyone and adulthood's really hard. And so for a lot of my 20s, I just really missed college. And my college reunion was this like intensely emotional, nostalgic, weird experience. And you're in this like physical space where you were a prior version of yourself and you have all of these memories that come flooding back. But you also think about who did I think I would be by the time I was 26, 27? Like, have I gone off track? Am I lost? Are there ways I can kind of restart my life? And I just thought, what a fun setting and premise for a novel to take place in that window of time. And I'm a big romance novel reader, and I love a second chance romance where you follow these two people who are exes and have blown it in the past. And I love learning how those people come back together and mend what they broke and start something new. And so the premise, the setting, it all kind of came together. And I'm really lucky that I had to quit my job right before the pandemic. Not lucky might be the wrong word, but I had a lot of downtime.
Right.
and worked on the book. And I'm just really grateful that now it's out there. But I think that it deals with a lot of themes of workplace burnout and queer identity and chosen family and trauma recovery. But it's also a fun college nostalgia book. And people are
Mhm.
playing beer pong and gossiping about who has like failed up or who sold out and became a lobbyist. Like, I think that I hope that it's a fun, healing, nostalgic read for people.
I think one of the things that's interesting, because I am Gen X, and
Mhm.
so, and when I went to college, it's like for me, I felt very isolated when I came to college.
Mhm.
I basically just kind of kept to myself for the most part. It wasn't until I really started to get into my major that I really started to connect with other people, meet friends. Uh, a lot of the friends that I, you know, have most fond memories of were the ones I had in high school, which was very
Mhm.
tight because I was in band and we had all sorts of trips together. And so I know when I finished reading it, listening to it, I made the point on social media. One of the things that I connected with about was the idea of reunions. And
Mhm.
I know when I went to my 10th high school reunion, I was certainly not in a place that I was comfortable being, I wasn't working in my major. I was working at the movie theater. I mean, I got in places at the movie theater. I'd moved up, but at the same time, it didn't feel like something where 10 years after high school, it's like I didn't see myself as what I wanted to be. And so it was tough. And I was somebody who, you know, a bunch of us went to our high school reunion. We basically hung out together, and then we would occasionally branch out, and I would get together with other people. We would talk to other people, but I wouldn't really share a whole lot about me. And I would
Mhm.
do kind of sheepishly. And so that anxiety of attending a reunion definitely connected with me about it. And no, I love the idea of found family. Some of my favorite pop culture is about found family.
Yeah.
I think that's something that fiction writers do really well because they either have experienced that in real life or they wish they had.
Mhm.
And I think that is something that really comes through really quite lovely in in the book. And I think it works so much in terms of, to your point, catching up with everybody. What is everybody doing? The gossip that people meet go through, as well as this idea of, well, I mean, if you just talk to some of these people, you'll realize that they're kind of maybe not as they're maybe not feeling their life as much as you think they
Mhm.
are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, when I went to my college reunion, I was somebody who seemed very successful, but privately was a total disaster. And so people were greeting me with like, "Oh, I watched your TEDx talk. Oh, you work at TED conferences." Like people seemed very impressed by me. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt like such a phony because I knew that I hated my job and that I
Right.
had like stalled out in my writing and I was in this awful relationship. And I had friends who seemed so successful but were privately really lost, or people who had really strayed from what they thought they would be doing, but were extraordinarily happy. And I think we all, especially with social media, we play the comparison game now so easily because we
Mm-hmm.
are seeing like the polished presentation of what everyone's lives are like. But the moment that you have those intimate conversations where you're both like, yeah, actually, my job sucks. And like, my husband is an asshole, like,
Mm-hmm.
it's really reassuring. But I think like, I'm glad the chosen family resonated. I think one of the themes and lessons of the book that I didn't even realize until the book was almost done was sometimes real success and well-being and happiness is just having your community and being able to be honest with them
Yeah.
and to talk to them and ask for support and confide in them. And the original title of the book was just The Reunion. And when we changed it to But How Are You Really? I was like, oh, that's the theme is answering that question and telling the truth. Like, aha, like my friend Gabe actually came up with that title. And I was like, oh, that's what the book has been about all along. And I didn't realize. So I'm glad, I'm glad that comes through so well. And it's funny, I was really lost for a lot of college. It wasn't until my senior year that I really felt like, oh, I have my best friends and I've like fallen in love with someone wonderful and I know what I'm doing. And even now, like that best friend from college, she and I aren't as close as we used to be. And that makes me kind of sad. Like, but when I went to my reunion, I hung out with people I was not friends with in high school or in college, but who have become really good friends since then because we all moved to the same city. So like it's never too late to meet those people who are really core to you, and it doesn't need to be like from these specific moments in time. But yeah, friends are good. We need friends.
We do. And I mean, I know for me, I was somebody who was, it's not that I don't know that I would say I was lost in college, but I was more comfortable by myself. And I was just, put my head down, get it done, go on whatever life has in store for me at that point. But, it was I am a recording major. I was a sound recording major. So I was in the music industry studies. So I was recording, and in those recording classes, that's where I met some of my best friends in terms of college, and one who's continued to be my best friend for 25 years. And it's one of those things that's really, it's about those people that come into your life at the right time when you need them. And that was definitely the case for the friends and the relationships that I had in college. And I think that's something that, and even when I was working at the movie theater, which I'm eternally grateful for. I met my wife at my movie theater. I I met some of my best friends at the movie theater, and for better or worse, it's led me into the job that I currently have, which I love. And it's one of those things where it's like once you find those people that, I'm an only child, so
Me too.
we don't have a whole lot of family down here. And so it's it's one of those things where it's like you find family where you need it. And that was something that really is kind of resonated with me throughout my adult life.
Mhm. Absolutely. I'm an only child too, and it's funny what you said about like spending a lot of time alone in college. I was the same way, especially like my freshman and sophomore year. And it's such an interesting environment because you're really forced to socialize so much that when you prefer to be alone or when you're spending more time alone than it seems like everyone else is, you're so self-conscious of that.
Mhm.
And I remember being really like, am I doing college wrong? Like, am I wasting time? Like, it is such a weird emotional period of growth and like self-consciousness and questioning. And yeah, you do. I agree that like some friends you just meet at the right time when you need them and you become super close. And there are people who I met in college who like people throw around the word trauma bonding a lot, but like I had
Mhm.
some crazy experiences in college that were deeply traumatic. And like the friends who were there for that, like lifelong bond. Like we can pick it up
Yeah.
where we left off, even if we don't see each other for years. And I wanted to recreate that with the characters in the book. But I feel like I'm having the opposite experience of that now where things are going pretty well in my life and I've made some amazing friends during like my author journey the last year, and I'm like, oh, these are people who I always want to be close to, and like we happen to meet in this really exciting wonderful time. And like how nice is that?
Exactly. No, exactly. And I mean, when you said you were, when you said at the beginning of the pandemic you were let go and you weren't quite sure whether that was the right way to put it. I
Mhm.
feel the exact same way because I mean, as a movie theater employee, they shut
Mhm.
down. So I was out of the job for months. And but at the same time, it gave me a chance to grow and expand
Mhm.
what I was doing with Sonic Cinema, with podcasting, meeting new people, getting on guest podcasts, starting to meet new people beyond just the friends that I knew in real life. And
Mhm.
so that was it's amazing what an unfortunate experience leads to
Mhm.
unexpected growth in a way
Mhm.
that should be really traumatic and harrowing, and to a certain extent still is. But at the same time, you look at it, and it's like, I got a lot out of that time.
Mhm.
And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, my therapist and I talk a lot about the both and, where like something can be horrible and also teach you a lot, bring you to new experiences. Like you can be very uncomfortable with that duality. And I think a lot about like, oh, I really wish I hadn't been in that abusive relationship. But if I hadn't been, I never would have met my current partner, or I never would have written this book because I happen to be in
Mm,
that place in my life. Like, and sometimes like getting laid off can really, it's horrible, it's financially stressful, it can be a disaster, but it might push you out of your comfort zone and force you to get creative. And I think
mhm.
living with that it can be both things at once is really important. And
Yeah.
I really wanted to write for Charlotte, the main character. She is a survivor of emotional abuse. She's got a whole bunch of trauma, but she's also just like a dork with a weird sense of humor who loves dogs and like loves to doodle and remembers all types of things. And she's very shy, but she's also like a fiercely good friend when she's not super depressed. Like the both and is really important.
Yeah.
And I think that's any good character has just a lot of complex, conflicting personality traits and impulses. And I, yeah, I tried really hard. I'm also seeing the cat stalking behind me right now. I got very distracted in my Zoom window. This is Spindrift. He is a big, big boy. Um, but yeah, the both and is good. And sometimes
Mhm.
being laid off or quitting a job with no plan is a blessing in disguise in the long run, even if it feels like garbage in the moment.
Absolutely. One of the things I did want to talk about, because I think this is going to be something that really does tie into the main subject of our
Mhm.
discussion today, the use of correspondences as a structural device in the book.
Mhm.
Because with chapter intros, with scene transitions, we get a lot of text back and forth, of emails back and forth, of Slack chats back and forth.
Mhm.
I think that is such a wonderful choice because of the fact that it really raises the emotions and the anxiety that we're kind of feeling in Charlotte's perspective, but it's also moving the story forward. So
Mhm.
where did the inspiration for that come from?
I don't know, to be honest. I the text messages and Slack messages were in there from the very beginning. Like I started the book with them. I knew that I wanted them to be a way to move between scenes and like to break up chapters. But I didn't know a lot about the purpose that they would serve until later. I used them as a way to do like exposition and to provide um, context of when like, oh, Charlotte has agreed to meet up with this person, or like Roger is continuing to annoy her, even though like she may not be talking about it in the scene. We're getting these little glimpses of her boss continuing to annoy her and ask for really stupid stuff. And it's also an opportunity for me to add a little bit of different characters' voices. Like we really get a sense of how pedantic and childish and demanding her boss is through the messages that he sends. But they're also little insertions of humor too. His requests are ridiculous. Jackie, her best friend, is like very snarky in her text messages.
Mm-hmm.
And I mostly just had fun with them. it wasn't until I started revising and thinking more deliberately that I paid attention to that the anxiety that you mentioned of Charlotte is constantly being nagged by people, whether it's Roger or his other assistant who's very incompetent, and her life is being interrupted over and over again. And it creates this kind of claustrophobic, just frustration throughout the book.
Mm.
And I think it helps kind of raise the stakes too of like, yeah, this any if she misses any one of these messages, it could have a cascading effect of like really messing up her weekend. Um, but yeah, I had so much fun writing them. I also really enjoyed when I realized how much of the climax of the book, I will not give any spoilers for folks who haven't read, but there's a scene that involves a lot of tweets towards the end of the book. And I wanted to seed that from the beginning of Charlotte has to live tweet her boss's commencement address. Like that's part of why she's come to the reunion is that so that she can be on campus when he gives this speech that has not been written. And she has to write these live tweets for a speech that doesn't exist. I used to do a lot of live tweeting when I worked full time in social media. So it was a little bit of me also being like, this is really frustrating. I've been in this situation. But I
Mhm.
really wanted to prime people with those messages so that when the drama really starts on Twitter, you've been aware of that digital screen experience, even though she's having
Mhm.
like a lot of in-person conversations. Um, but yeah, they're also just fun. I love a book that incorporates those text message and Slack messages organically in a way that doesn't feel forced. Like I didn't want it to feel like this is Gen Z slang. Like, no, these are just like dorky millennials like checking in with each other throughout the week. And like these are just normal messages that people send each other on Slack. It's not super like I didn't want to be cringe. Although my book has been called Millennial Cringe, which is fine with me because I am millennial cringe. Um, but yeah, I love when people do that well. And it is kind of an update on like the old fashioned epistolary novels, like we'll talk about with Bridgerton. Like I love those like multimedia moments where you're getting a glimpse at like what are they reading or what are the letters they're exchanging. And it was just so much fun. And I'm glad that they got to stay in there. And yeah.
So the main one of the main topics that we are talking about today is the idea of adapting source material from one medium to another. So if somebody were to adapt but how are you really into either a TV series or miniseries or movie, what would be the most important part of that adaptation for you?
That's a great question. Um, I I do have a film and TV rights agent, so if anybody listens and is interested, let us know. But yeah, I think one of the things that would be really important to me and that I think would be a challenge to the screenwriter and production team is like so much of this book is really internal. Like it's Charlotte
Mhm.
processing her emotions and trauma. And I think that it would be an interesting challenge to the team working on an adaptation of like, how do you capture that visually? How do you capture that on screen? And Charlotte herself thinks about and processes her emotions a lot with color. She is a visual artist and she also she uses the feelings wheel, like the emotion sensation wheel, which is a psychological tool that some therapists use. That it's literally just a giant color wheel and they've assigned different emotions to it. And it can be really
Mhm.
helpful if you have difficulty processing or verbalizing your emotions to be like, oh, I'm feeling neglected or oh I'm feeling self-conscious or like joyful emotions too. Charlotte will refer to that while she's processing in the book of like oh the I'm forgetting the what all of the colors were. I had like a whole chart in my own mind of what colors Charlotte assigned to different emotions, but I feel like it would be really fun for the cinematographer or whoever else to use color and lighting in that type of way to get at some of the more internal stuff. But I know nothing about film, despite I took film analysis 101 in college. That is the extent of my film knowledge, other than just like having opinions about story. So if it is ever adapted, I will very much defer.
Right.
But yeah, but it is, I think that like preserving the emotional arc of Charlotte and what she experiences through like her PTSD, I think would be a
Hmm.
central thing to capture and a fun challenge to whoever took up that torch.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, I think that really it obviously depends on the type of story you're telling because some
Mhm,
movies or some stories you're going to have a lot of action in them. Some
mhm,
stories you're going to have big sequences that are just central to creating the emotions in the story. And I do think the internal aspect of the story would definitely be a challenge, but I do think it would be an interesting challenge to see. And
mhm,
to your point, using the visual language of the color wheel, I can definitely see that as being something that would work into an adaptation. So, transitioning away from there, we are talking about an adaptation of a series of books from author Julia Quinn, known as the Bridgerton series, and they've been adapted to the hit Netflix series Bridgerton, created by Chris Van Dusen. And one of the things that I have I've listened to several of these books with my wife,
mhm,
and it's been since we started to watch the series. And one of the things that is interesting to me, especially listening to some of them in context of watching the seasons as we've seen the seasons unfold, is that you don't really see moments where you feel like the changes the the very distinct choices made when it comes to race for the
mhm,
series are that out of place when it comes to the novel, because the novels do they feel very much like romance novels, like classical romance novels in a lot of ways, but we don't really. But one of the things I like about the way the series unfolds is it unfolds in this alternate universe
mhm.
where black people have much may more rights than they did in the 1800s, and even
Yes, big
elevated
understatement.
to places of power.
Mhm,
And I think it is such an interesting I think it's such an interesting choice to have that be a big part of this world while adapting these stories that are fundamentally, when we imagine them listening to them or reading them, we would certainly have a specific idea in our head of what these are going to be like.
mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think Bridgerton is such an interesting series of books to adapt because they're a bit dated reading them now. Like they were written in the 2000s. They people in romance sometimes talk about like the alpha asshole, like that archetype of male love interest who is kind of a
Mm-hmm.
jerk, but like very masculine and very forceful. Like that stereotype pops up in the book. Like there are certain elements of the way that men and women interact that feels kind of dated. Like there's a moment in Romancing Mr. Bridgerton, which is Colin and Penelope's love story, where Colin gets really mad at Penelope and like describes grabbing her and like shaking her. And like
Mm-hmm.
there are moments of like weird physical aggression. Like it's an older series. And that's no shade on Julia Quinn. I think that like she has matured as an author in terms of like matured is the wrong word, but like they were very of their time when they were published. And it's been really cool to see how the series, when being adapted for Netflix, not only takes those stories and brings them up to the present, but also says, screw it, we're going to do something completely different about race.
Yeah.
And it's not perfect the way they do it. Like it doesn't really make sense all of the time. There are moments where racism might exist, and
Mm-hmm.
then it's just like it's kind of confusing of like what is the actual theory of race in this world, but it's so refreshing to see people of color in all of these different positions. The queen is a Black woman. It's really cool. I think it's very bold. I think it's just so exciting. I do think it's very funny the way that like racism doesn't exist, but homophobia kind of does. Like some of the characters are like very unsure like what gay people are, and Benedict has this bisexual awakening, which is amazing to see. There's like polyamory, but it's like stigma exists in some places and not others. So I do think the show is like kind of strange, but it is very fun. And I think that it makes it escapist for even more people. Like I think even more people can watch it and see themselves in it and relax. And I think that's really just really wonderful.
Yeah. And I mean, I know I've definitely enjoyed it as we've watched it because of the fact that it feels very familiar in terms
Mhm,
of structure, in terms of some of the ideas on love, as far as marrying for love versus marrying for responsibility. And
mhm,
again, things we've seen plenty of times over in plenty of pop culture. But I feel like they get the emotions right,
mhm,
especially in those central relationships as each season progresses. And I think one of the things that I think is so delightful is that they've built a tremendous cast in the series in general, where it's like you have all of these side characters that all have important parts to play, maybe not in every episode, but in some episodes. Like
mhm,
Penelope's sisters have parts to play, whether it's being withering and just kind of daffy, or her mother just
mhm,
being domineering.
mhm.
And then the Bridgerton clan in general. There's so many wonderful relationship dynamics and character dynamics at play that I think it's to take something that is very traditional on the page and make it something that feels very, to your point, contemporary, because I do think there are contemporary ideas at play that I think is it's such an important part of adaptation that it's almost like Herculean that they were able to make it work as well as they did.
Yeah, I to your point, they basically took a series where each book hones in on one specific couple and everyone else is very secondary and serves that couple's journey. They took that series and made it into an ensemble cast show. And each season focuses on a different couple, but not at the expense of those other characters. Like everyone has their own side plots, with the exception of what's his name? I keep thinking Sebastian. Simon, the first Duke from the first
Mm,
series. With the exception of him, because those actors moved on, him and Daphne. The other couples remain part of the story and have things to do. And I was really confused when they first announced the adaptation of Bridgerton because I was like, how are they going to do this? Like, all of the books are so they're linked, but they're meant to be read as standalone. So you can kind of jump in the series wherever you want to. And I think they've done a really good job navigating that and making the series one that you can fall in love with and stay with. And adding depth to those secondary characters. Like you mentioned, the Featheringtons. Penelope's mom, Lady Featherington, is so weird and snarky and mean, but complicated. And like
yeah.
she has so much agency, and in the books, she's just like a mean joke. Like no one likes
Mhm.
her. People, everybody talks shit about her. Like everyone is afforded more depth, which I really appreciate. The other person who's, oh no, I've forgotten her name. She's kind of the villain character who bullies Penelope and becomes friends with Eloise.
Right.
Yes, she's really just like an asshole in the books. Like she's very flat, but we have much more compassion for her in the television show because we get a sense of why is she behaving like this? What is her home life like? What is her destiny if she doesn't get what she wants? Like there's so much more room for complexity and depth in the television show. And that's not to say that the books are shallow, but it's just like a very different experience.
Oh yeah.
And it's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, this is part of the reason why I brought up the structures, what you do with structure in terms of the text messages, the Slack chats, and all that. The books do similar things with correspondences,
Mhm,
whether it's Whistledown's letters, whether it's letters from one character to another. It's all a part of a fabric of giving more narrative heft to these events that we're reading or listening about.
mhm,
And to your point, I think one of the things that is so, and we especially saw it this season, I feel like,
mhm,
um, one of the things I think is so impressive about this series is the fact that while yes, they're focusing on the main two characters, they're also, to your point, fleshing out secondary characters, but also planting seeds for future stories. Like
mhm,
as we've seen, especially with this season, we get a little bit of hint of Eloise. We get a little bit of
mhm,
hint of Francesca's story.
mhm,
And I think that's something that really only long form storytelling like television can do.
mhm,
Like you can try to do it in movies. It's not exactly the same thing. It's not going to be the same thing because ultimately you need to have a stopping point
mhm.
where each movie's got beginning, middle, and end. Here, with each season, yes, you have an ending point, but you know it's not the end of the story. You know there's more that's
Mhm.
going to be told.
Yeah, it's each season has its own like beginning, climax, and ending, but because of like the main couple's love story, but you know that's not the end of the Bridgerton story. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really interesting. I think it's like it's something that I see really borrowed from romance as a book genre very well, because a lot of romance authors will quite deliberately plan a series of books that are interlinked, where you can see the seeds being planted, but you can jump in wherever you want to. And I think Bridgerton is such an interesting example of it, because Lady Whistledown, for the first four books in the eight book series, Lady Whistledown's columns are present in all of those books. But
Mm-hmm.
it's such a shock in the books when you learn who Lady Whistledown is, because it really is. It's in the middle of the fourth book that you learn. And in the television show, it's much earlier. I think it's like the season one climax,
Yeah,
like the
at the
season one
very end,
finale.
yeah, the very end of season
Yeah.
one's when we
So
find
we
out.
have all of season two to know that this is coming with Penelope. And I personally thought that it took away a lot of like the thrill of learning who she is later on when she's in her story with Colin. So that was a choice where I was like, that's interesting. I don't know if I like that, but
Mm-hmm.
it's such a good connective tissue having that Lady Whistledown column.
Well, and I think, especially with the way they handle in the TV series, I think the reason, I mean, I'm with you where it's like it does remove some of the tension from the Colin
Mhm,
Penelope story, but at the same time it doesn't, because the fact that Eloise finds out by the end of season two,
mhm,
and so then you see the tension start to form between her and Penelope, who have been
mhm.
best friends,
Yeah, that's
who are
true.
inseparable. And then in season three, you've got that tension at the beginning where Eloise is wanting her to come clean and be honest, but then she's got this relationship with Colin, and we know his feelings on
Mhm.
Whistledown.
Yeah.
So I do think so. I mean, there is still tension, but it's a different type of tension.
That's very true. And I think like it points to how in the television show, like you said, we see more of the relationships between the other characters. And the reveal of Penelope being Whistledown is not just an issue in her romantic relationship, it is an issue with her and Eloise. And like their
Yeah.
relationship is much more important in the television show. And it makes me wonder what they'll do with Eloise's book, which I think is one of the worst books in the series. And I'm very curious how that'll be adapted. But the premise of Eloise's book is that she's so hurt by the reveal that Penelope is Lady Whistledown and that she's gotten her happy ending with Colin, that she just like screws off and like runs away and impulsively decides to try to marry someone. And it always felt really silly reading it. And I'm really curious what the television show will do, because like that just won't work in the same way. And Eloise
Right.
as a character has changed. Um, but yeah, it is. Ugh, I do love Eloise and Penelope. I also just want Eloise to be gay, but I'm not in charge.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that is I think that is one of the things that has been interesting about the series. Like we've seen these changes to characters that are, and some that have been hinted at that are going to come into play in those later stories.
Yeah.
And obviously the big one this season was Francesca,
Hmm.
and that was obviously very controversial to the point where Julia Quinn had to write a note and say, "Look, I I understand why it's difficult for you to like maybe accept this, but I trust what they're doing with it,
Yeah.
and
And please
I'm
calm down.
exactly, and I'm actually more excited to see that story
Mhm.
unfold,
Me too.
especially now that we like, because in the book, we, at least in Francesca's book, we only hear about her husband. We don't
Hmm.
actually get to know him, and now that we get to know him, it's going to make that hurt so much more when that comes.
Oh,
And it's
absolutely.
and I it's that is one of the things that I love about TV shows, where it's like you fall in love with these characters, you get to know these characters, and you, especially if it's adapted from something. And I'm somebody who I probably don't read as much as I should, but at the same time, I mean, when I do read books of long series, where it's like, oh, I can't wait to see what this is going to be like, and then it
Hmm.
happens, I'm like, okay, if I've read it, I'm like, okay, I'm not quite sure how I feel about that, but
Hmm.
I trust where they're going with it, and
Hmm.
I think there's a lot, and to your point about Eloise's story, it's like, yeah, this is going to make Eloise's story much more interesting. Like where's her story going to take her in the
Hmm.
interim to get to that point?
Absolutely. And I think like the changes with Francesca's character are so exciting. Francesca's book is probably my favorite in the series, although it has its flaws, because I love the idea of a widow finding love again, and that love being just as important to her as the previous love. Like romance novels tend to be so monogamous and so based on
Mm-hmm.
like soulmates. And it's so cool to have Francesca, who also like in the books is this very, she's a very mature character. She's very experienced compared to the other women in the series. Like she takes no shit. She knows what she's doing. She's an adult. She's grown.
Yeah.
And I think that it'll be interesting to see. That's not how I would describe her television character at this
Mm-hmm.
point, but because she's not going to be the next focused love story, I'm excited to see how she develops as a character too, and how she like stakes her independence and continues to evolve. I think what it boils down to is I have a lot of trust in the adaptation
Yeah.
and the decisions that they'll make. And I think because I love the Bridgerton books, but I can recognize their flaws, I'm excited to see those stories be polished and updated, because I don't see them as like ruining the books. Um,
Yeah.
I used to feel that way about adaptations, and now that I'm adult, I'm like, they're separate things. A friend of mine actually said to me, like, the adaptation is kind of like the weird cousin of the book. Like, it's going to be its own thing. It's going to share DNA, but it's going to be different. And I think like the Bridgerton series is, yeah, they're just making good calls. And like I don't agree with all of them, but I agree with most of them. And I think that the adaptations have gotten stronger. I just wish they'd stop like inserting weird love triangles that don't need to be there. But that's also like a Shonda Rhimes thing. Like that's just something they like doing. But yeah, we'll see.
hmm No, I'm excited about that as well because of the fact that and one of the reasons going to Francesca's story without giving too much away, the the thing that I the thing that I love about that, what the changes we've seen possibly mean for that story moving forward, is I can see it only enhancing the
Yeah.
emotions of the book even more
Hmm.
because it's not just about can I love again? It's what does this love mean? And this love
Hmm.
is drastically different than what I had before. And
Yeah,
it's also it's really exciting to see it's really exciting to anticipate something like that coming through.
absolutely. Yeah, there's gonna be so much for poor Francesca to unpack. She's gonna have so much to process. And also like Michael Sterling in the books is Francesca's love interest. And like he's one of those characters who I really love in the book, but rereading it, I was like, wow, yeah, he's like been spending time in India doing God knows what. Like there's some like weird like British colonialization stuff going on. And I'm
Yeah,
just like, honestly, this is a character that like can do with an update. Like
right.
I'm
Yeah,
not actually that sad to see him being changed because that's again like part of that modernization of these books. I'm like, yes, let's maybe not have a colonizer love interest.
exactly. Exactly. Um, let's see, trying to think if I have anything else. Did you have anything else that you wanted to say before we wrap up?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think one of the things that I love about Bridgerton as an adaptation is that it really does preserve the escapism of romance novels, but also just like the really captures the emotional intensity and the longing and the fact that yes, these are kind of silly problems and silly stories, but they're not silly because they are extremely fun and they highlight feelings and relationships and like how
Mhm.
to be a good partner. And it feels trite to be like, these are stories about what women want because I don't think it's that simple or that
Mhm.
gendered, but it is like, yeah, these are extremely popular books and television series that highlight things that are important to women. And I just, oh my God, Anthony is my personal favorite from the television show so far. Like, he is just such a fun love interest and character and like so obnoxious, but also just like he is such a wife guy. And it's
Mhm.
like, it's such a joy to see him and his wife interact anytime they're on screen. But yeah, I'm thrilled that it's brought more people to romance. And I really, if people do enjoy Bridgerton, the television show or the books, like there's so many good historical romances out there that you should pick
Mhm.
up because Bridgerton is it's a phenomenal series, but it's not like the best historical romance series. Like there's so much more to discover. And I hope that people feel comfortable like going down the rabbit hole on like bookshop.org and reading more. Like Sarah McLean's stories are amazing, Lisa Kleypas is amazing, Courtney Milan, like they're really diverse historical romances to dive into. And yeah, I love it. I want more people reading romance.
Well, and on that note, Ella, where can we find your writing?
Yeah, read my book. It's not a historical romance unless you consider 2013 historical, which for some Gen Z, I guess it really is. Yeah, but How Are You Really is available at booksellers across the United States and online. And you can find me at patreon.com/bros and prose because I very often write prose about bros. And I'm also Bros and Pros on every social media platform. I'm spending a lot of time on Threads lately. So if you want like my half-baked opinions about the election, you can find me over on Threads.
Well, and seeing as though the way things have gone on Twitter, I've definitely been more pro threads recently as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely feel that. But yes, check out Ella's writing, check out her book. It's really wonderful story. And Ella, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure.